Half dead in the trail dust, rope burned and fevered, the Apache woman would change his life before Amos Calder even learned her name. And by the time the sun cleared noon that day, nothing in his careful, silent world would ever sit the same way again. The heat came off the ground in waves that morning, thick enough to bend the far hills into a shimmer, and the dust on the Presidio Trail rose in a fine red haze behind every step his gelding took. Amos had ridden this stretch of Arizona territory more times than he could count, checking the sagging fence line that marked the north edge of his spread, and hunting down two longhorns that had wandered off in the night. It was work that demanded nothing of him but his hands and his eyes, and that was precisely the kind of work he had built his whole life around, since the year everything else had been stripped away from him. He was 32, though the lines fanning out from his eyes made him look older. Earned the hard way, one bad season at a time. Broad through the shoulders from a decade of fence posts and branding irons, quiet in a way that unsettled strangers who mistook his silence for coldness. It wasn't coldness, it was economy. A man learns after enough loss not to spend words he doesn't need on people who won't be staying long enough to deserve them. 3 years back, he had a wife named Naomi and a daughter not yet 5, a bright, stubborn little girl who smelled of wood smoke and biscuit flour instead of the empty tin and leather silence the house carried now. A band of raiders had swept through the valley in the dark, hitting 3 ranches in a single terrible night, and Amos had been 2 days' ride away delivering cattle when it happened. He came home to Ash. He had never fully left that morning. Some stubborn, buried part of him was still standing frozen in the doorway of a house that no longer existed, and every choice he'd made since then. The isolation, the long, silent hours, the way he flinched from town gatherings and church socials and anything that asked him to hope for something again, traced a straight, unbroken line back to that doorway. So when he first saw the uneven shape at the bend of the trail that morning, his eyes slid over it the way a tired man's eyes slide over a fallen cottonwood limb or a downed calf, ordinary and unremarkable. He nearly rode past it entirely. Something in the angle of it stopped him, too soft, too human, half buried in red dust, with one arm flung toward water. He knew was a half-mile off, even blindfolded. He was down off the horse before he'd fully decided to be, one hand drifting toward his revolver out of old habit, caution warring against something faster and far less careful. It was a woman, young, younger than he first guessed, 20 at the most, an Apache, her clothing torn at shoulder and hem, her skin flushed dark with both heat and fever. Bruises mapped up both arms in shades of yellow-green, fading into fresh, angry purple. Her wrists were the worst of it, rope burns, deep and raw, crusted where the binding had cut in more than once, as though she had fought it and lost, and fought it again anyway. "Ma'am," his voice came out rough, unused that morning. He knelt in the dust beside her, close enough now to see her ribs pulling in short, shallow breaths. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, dark lashes against skin gone pale under the fever's flush, and for one long moment he thought he'd imagined even that. Then her lips moved, barely more than breath. One word. Horse. That was all she gave him before her head lolled and her whole body went slack in the dirt. And Amos didn't wait around for more of it. He got his arms under her. She weighed next to nothing, which frightened him worse than any of the bruises did, and lifted her the careful way a man lifts a child, mindful of the risks, mindful of a body that flinched even unconscious at the wrong kind of grip. He settled her onto the gelding in front of him, one arm locked tight around her narrow waist, and turned for home at a pace just this side of reckless. If slow, hard-won trust between two strangers keeps you watching, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name for early access to new videos. The ranch house sat a mile back from the trail, low and sturdy, raised by Amos's own hands in the 2 years after the fire took the first one. It wasn't much. One main room, a sleeping loft, a lean-to kitchen he'd tacked on the second summer. But it was solid, and it was his. And until that morning, no soul but Amos had crossed its threshold in longer than he cared to reckon. He laid her across the only bed the house owned, the bed that had been his alone since Naomi, and some old, buried part of him ached at the sight of a woman's dark hair, loose against that particular pillow again. Even as he tried to tell himself the ache meant nothing at all, her fever burned hot through that whole first night. Amos worked the way he worked every hard thing in his life, steady without fuss, soaking cloths in the well-cold water and laying them across her brow and throat, coaxing sips of water past cracked lips, cleaning the rope burns with a gentleness that startled even him, out of practice as his hands were, with anything softer than rough ranch labor. He didn't yet know her name. He didn't know where she'd come from, or who had marked her this way, or how far she'd run before her body finally quit on that lonesome trail. He only knew that leaving her to the buzzard's patience had never once crossed his mind, not for the space of a single heartbeat, and that plain fact told him something about the man he still was, buried under 3 years of grief-hardened solitude. He did not sleep that first night, not truly. He sat the chair beside the bed with his boots still on, listening to the ragged catch of her breathing, counting the minutes between each cool cloth, the way another man might count a rosary. Twice her fever spiked high enough that she thrashed against the blanket, muttering broken fragments in a language he didn't know. And both times he simply held the cool cloth steady against her brow and waited, saying nothing, because there was nothing a stranger's voice could offer a woman deep in a fever dream except the plain fact of not being alone in it. Somewhere past midnight, he found himself thinking of Naomi's last fever, the one that took Grace first and nearly took her too, before the raid finished what the sickness hadn't, and he made himself set the memory down gently, the way a man sets down a blade he isn't ready to use. This woman was not his wife. This woman was, for the moment, only a stranger's suffering laid across his bed, and he told himself that was reason enough to see her through it, whatever came after. She woke on the second morning, and the change in her was immediate and total. One breath she lay still in the gray early light. The next her whole body had gone rigid, eyes wide and wild, scanning the strange room for the nearest way out. Amos sat in the room's one chair, deliberately several careful feet from the bed, mending a bridle strap because his hands wanted something to do, and he'd learned long ago that a man sitting idle looks far more dangerous to a frightened creature than a man with quiet work already in his lap. "You're safe here." He kept his voice low and even, the same steady tone a man uses gentling a spooked colt, and he did not rise from the chair. "Nobody's going to lay a hand on you in this house. Doors unlatched from the inside. You're free to leave the very moment you're strong enough to walk, and I won't lift one finger to stop you. I'd only be grateful if you'd eat something first." She didn't answer. Her eyes tracked him the way a cornered animal tracks a raised hand, and her one good fist, the wrist not wrapped in linen over the worst of the burns, had curled hard into the blanket, as though she meant to use it as a weapon if it came down to that. Amos understood the look better than he let on. He'd seen its cousin in his own reflection some mornings in that first raw year after the fire. He didn't push her. He set a bowl of broth on the small table within her reach, went back to his mending, and let the silence between them do whatever slow, patient work silence knows how to do. It took 3 more days before she offered him a word he could understand, and even then it was only her name, given like a test she fully expected him to fail. Chenoa. She said it once, watching his face closely for the flinch or the mockery or the clumsy mispronunciation that would confirm every hard thing she'd already decided about men and their houses. He tried the shape of it back, careful, correcting himself once, and something in her shoulders eased by the smallest fraction of an inch. Not trust, not yet, but the absence just for a moment of bracing for the worst, and for a woman who'd had every reason under heaven to expect the worst, that absence alone was close enough to a miracle. The mornings settled into a quiet, careful rhythm of their own after that. Broth at sunup, clean linen for the wrists at midday, a low murmur of half-formed English traded back and forth across the small room in the long, slow afternoons. Amos found himself talking more than he had in 3 years, filling the silences with plain, ordinary things. The names of the hills visible from the window, the particular stubbornness of the well pump in dry weather, the mare he'd been meaning to break before all of this happened, not because he expected an answer, but because a voice in the room, even his own, seemed to ease something tight behind her eyes. Sometimes she watched him while he talked, unreadable, and sometimes she drifted towards sleep in the middle of it. And either way he kept talking, because it cost him nothing and seemed slowly to be worth something to her. Over the days that followed, given to him only in pieces and only when she was ready to give them, Amos learned the shape of what had happened to her. She was Chiricahua, from a band pressed thin and scattered by years of hard treaties and harder winters. She had been taken by men who trafficked in captives the way other men trafficked cattle, moving her and others like her towards some buyer or trader whose face she never gave him and whose details he never needed to understand the shape of the horror. She had slipped her bindings 3 nights before he found her and run until her legs simply stopped answering, collapsing on a trail she hadn't even known led anywhere at all, let alone toward help. I did not think there would be a horse. She sat propped against the pillows now, a bowl of broth balanced carefully in her lap. Her English still finding its footing, but growing surer by the day. I thought there would be nothing waiting, or something worse than nothing. A rare, crooked warmth pulled at the corner of Amos's mouth, the first real one, in longer than he wanted to reckon. There was a horse, ugly gelding, bites if you're not careful with him, but he got you here in one piece, and that's the part that matters. She studied him a long while after that, the way she studied everything in those early wary days, weighing and measuring, hunting for the crack where cruelty would finally show through. She never found one. That absence, more than any tenderness he could have spoken aloud, seemed to be what finally began thawing something frozen deep inside her. The fever broke on the 5th day, and with it went the sharpest edge of the wariness, though not all of it, not for a long while yet. Chenoa started moving through the small house under her own power, testing her legs first against the wall, then against a chair back, then finally against nothing at all, standing in the open doorway with morning light on her face like a woman relearning what it felt like to choose where she stood. Amos caught himself watching her more often than a man tending a healing patient rightly ought to, and told himself it was ordinary concern, and knew even as he thought it that the telling wasn't quite the whole truth of the matter. She insisted on it long before Amos thought she was ready, waving off his objections with a look that told him plainly enough she had already decided the matter without him. She began helping around the ranch before she was rightly fit to, the way strong people always do, mending a torn shirt she found folded in his trunk, sweeping the packed dirt floor clean, coaxing a stubborn morning fire back to life with more skill than Amos himself usually managed. He told her more than once to rest. She mostly ignored him, in the particular manner of a woman who had spent far too long with no choices at all, and now meant to exercise every single one available to her, down to the smallest. He came to admire that in her faster than he'd expected to admire anything again in his life. Near the start of the second week, low on flour and coffee and needing a new head for the axe, Amos hitched the wagon for a supply run to the small crossroads settlement 2 hours south, and Chenoa asked, quietly but plainly, to come along. He hesitated. A town full of strangers was a risk he hadn't weighed yet, for either of their sakes, but he understood, too, that keeping her penned inside the house indefinitely would only teach her a smaller version of the same cage she'd already escaped once. She rode beside him on the wagon bench with her chin level and her eyes steady, and if the handful of townsfolk at the mercantile stared a beat too long at the Apache woman sitting easy next to Amos Calder, she did not shrink from a single one of those looks. The storekeeper's wife, a stout, plain-spoken woman named Ruth Ann, who had buried her own husband to fever 2 winters back, took one long measure of Chenoa's healing risks and said nothing at all about it beyond asking, kindly, whether she preferred her coffee ground, fine or coarse. It was a small mercy, offered without pity, and Chenoa thanked her for it in careful English, and something in her spine eased another notch on the ride home. Amos noticed. He noticed most things about her by then, whether he meant to or not. By the second week, she was riding the fence line with him most mornings, sitting a borrowed mare with an ease that told him she'd grown up around horses long before any of this misery ever touched her. Her seat sure and unhurried even over broken ground that made lesser riders grip the horn. Her hand stayed quick, her eyes sharper than his. She spotted a rattler coiled in the shade of a rock outcrop before Amos had even registered the low warning buzz, and slowly in fits and starts, she began giving him things freely instead of only in answer to his questions. A memory of her mother's cooking fire, a story about her younger sister, Dateste, separated from her in the chaos of the same raid that scattered their whole band, whose fate Chenoa did not know and carried like a stone, lodged permanently under her ribs. She would be 16 now. The two of them sat together on the porch step one evening as the sky went the color of a healing bruise, orange bleeding slow into deep violet over the western ridge. Fast, faster than me even. She used to beat me to the river every single summer and never once let me forget it. You'll find her. He looked out at the darkening hills instead of at her, the way a man does when he's saying something truer than he's used to saying out loud. I gave up on a great many things after I lost mine. Turns out giving up on someone and them actually being gone are two very different griefs, and for a long stretch I confused them for the same thing. Don't make my mistake, Chenoa. Not with her. She didn't answer that particular night, but she reached over and laid her hand briefly across his on the porch board between them. The first time she had touched him without flinching first, and neither one of them remarked on it aloud, Though both of them noticed it plainly enough, and both of them thought about it long after the lamps were out. The weeks that followed settled into something Amos hadn't allowed himself in 3 long years, a rhythm shared with another living, breathing soul. Chenoa's English sharpened daily, sanded smooth through use, and she began giving him words of her own in return. For the mountains ringing the valley, for the mescal plants she showed him how to harvest the proper way her grandmother had taught her, for a particular quality of dawn light that had no clean equivalent in his own tongue, and that he found himself turning over in his mind long after the sun had climbed well past it. She laughed more as the weeks stretched on, a low surprise sound each time, like a woman startled to discover the things still lived somewhere inside her after all. Summer wore on toward its slow end, the grass along the wash gone gold and brittle, the evenings finally carrying the first thin edge of cool. One afternoon, hunting for a spare blanket in the trunk at the foot of the bed, Chenoa's hand closed on a folded shawl she hadn't seen before. Soft blue wool gone faded at the fold lines. A few careful stitches of embroidery worked along one edge by a hand that had clearly loved the work. She didn't need to ask whose it had been. She found Amos out at the corral and held it out to him without a word, ready to apologize for prying. But he only took it from her carefully, the way a man takes something that might break, and turned it over once in his hands. "Naomi's mother made this for her," he said finally. "Never could bring myself to give it away or bury it with the rest. Didn't know what to do with it, so I just kept it in the trunk and didn't look." He held it a moment longer, then folded it and pressed it back into Chenoa's hands instead of his own. "Keep it. Cold's coming. No sense a good shawl sitting in a trunk gathering dust when somebody living could use it." She wore it that evening, and every cool evening after, and if it cost him something the first time he saw it on her shoulders, it cost him something gentler than grief. He caught himself more than once watching the sunlight fall across her while she worked the garden plot she'd insisted on planting, squash and beans mounded together the old way, so the vines would climb, and feeling something stir in his chest that he hadn't permitted himself since the fire took Naomi and their daughter. It frightened him some. Hope had already cost him everything once, but it frightened him a good deal less than the alternative, which was watching this woman heal and grow strong, and pretending all the while that he felt nothing at all while she did it. Chenoa noticed things too. She noticed how he still set 2 plates at supper most nights without seeming to think about it. She noticed how careful and slow his hands went whenever hers came anywhere near his own. The grief that crossed his face sometimes when he believed she wasn't looking, aimed at a wife and a little girl she'd never once met, but had somehow in these strange weeks come to feel she understood a piece of. She never pushed him toward speaking of them beyond whatever he offered up on his own. She carried losses of her own that needed careful handling, and she extended him the same patience he'd shown her in those first wary days. And between the two of them, a quiet understanding grew that needed remarkably few words to bear its full weight. "You don't lock your door," she observed one night, not quite framing it as a question. "No reason to, before." He didn't look at her right away when the rest of the sentence came. "Now, I suppose there's reason enough." Something warm settled into the space between them that night, something that had nothing to do with the fire crackling low in the hearth. Before we ride any further into this story, I want to ask you for something small. Become a channel member. Tap join beside the channel name. It costs you almost nothing, and it tells us plainly that you want more stories exactly like this one. It was near the start of the 7th week that the piece of the valley began fraying at its edges. Amos noticed it first as a stranger's dust far off along the southern ridge, gone by the time he'd raised his spyglass. Nothing conclusive, the sort of thing a careful man files away without a word. It happened again 2 mornings later, closer this time. A shape at the tree line that belonged to no neighbor he recognized vanished into the brush before he caught a clear look at it. Chenoa watched him studying the ridge with new tension gathered in his shoulders, and she read the truth of it correctly before he'd said one word about it. "They're looking for me." It wasn't framed as a question either. Amos didn't shade the truth from her. "Might be nothing at all. Drifters maybe, but I'd sooner we were ready and wrong than easy and sorry, whichever way this turns out." She nodded slowly, and something settled behind her eyes that he recognized well. Not fear exactly, or not only fear. Resolve. The look of a woman deciding in one deliberate moment that she would never again be caught helpless. "Then teach me the rifle. I know horses already. I know this land now better than most who've lived here longer than I have. Teach me the rifle, and I will stand beside you when they come, Amos, not hide behind you." For a moment he only stood there in the low evening light, turning the request over the way he turned over any decision that mattered, unwilling to answer too quickly and unwilling to answer wrong. He wanted to argue against it, some stubborn old instinct in him, the same part that had failed Naomi and their daughter, and had spent 3 punishing years blaming a 2-day ride for it, wanted to tell her to stay hidden, stay small, let him handle whatever came riding up that wash. He looked instead at the steadiness that had grown into her these last weeks, at the woman who had crawled free of captivity on raw will and rebuilt herself piece by piece in his kitchen and his garden and along his fence lines. And he understood plainly that telling her now to hide would insult everything she had already survived to become. "Come sunup," he said, "we start." They spent the days that followed preparing in the focused, particular quiet of 2 people who understand exactly what's riding toward them and refuse to waste a single hour pretending otherwise. He taught her the rifle and found she carried a natural eye for it, steady hands and patient breath, the same qualities that had already made her quick with horses translating cleanly into a longer, calmer aim. He walked the fence lines with her and pointed out the ground that favored a defender, the low rise behind the barn, the choke point where the wash narrowed before opening onto the yard, the blind stretches an attacker on foot would be forced to cross wide open. She took it all in and layered her own knowledge on top of his. Having grown up learning terrain the way other children learn their letters, and more than once it was her reading of the ground that sharpened his plan rather than the reverse. They rehearsed it more than once, the way a man rehearses a fire drill he prays he'll never need. Amos to the loft at the first sign of trouble, Chenoa to the choke point in the wash. The horses moved to the sheltered pen behind the barn, where a stray shot was least likely to find them. She practiced reloading in the dark until her hands could do it without her eyes, and Amos found himself more than once grateful in a way he hadn't expected to be. Grateful for the plain, hard fact of her competence. This wasn't a woman he needed to shield from the world. This was a woman who had already survived worse than anything likely to come riding up that wash, and who had chosen, deliberately, to stand her ground on his land, rather than run from it a second time. That choice steadied something in him he hadn't known was still unsteady. At night, once the work was finally done, and the house had gone quiet around them, they talked in a way neither had quite let themselves before, about what might come after, if there was to be an after at all. Chenoa spoke again of her sister, of the river settlements north of the territory where scattered bands sometimes found their way back together, where she might finally learn word of Dateste after all these months of not knowing. Amos found himself for the first time in 3 years picturing a future with another living person standing squarely inside it. And the picturing didn't hurt the way he had always braced for it to hurt. It felt instead like a window cracked open at last in a room that had been sealed shut for far too long. "When this is settled," he said carefully, the words tested like a man testing thin ice underfoot, "I could ride north with you, help you look for her." Chenoa turned to face him fully, something bright and startled moving across her expression before it settled into something steadier, warmer. "You would leave this place? Your own land?" "Land's still here whether I'm standing on it or riding off it," Amos said. "Some things matter a good deal more than fence posts. Took me a long stretch of grieving and a woman half dead in my trail dust to remember it. But I remember it now, plain as anything." She didn't answer him in words that time. She crossed the short distance of the porch and took his hand in both of hers. The rope-burned scars along her wrists mostly healed now to thin pale lines, a mark of what she had survived rather than a wound still bleeding, and held it there a long while. And the two of them sat together in the dark, watching the same stars that had watched over each of their griefs, feeling for the first time in a good long while that the weight of the past might not be the only thing left worth carrying forward. 3 more nights passed quiet, and then a fourth brought a lone rider circling the far pasture at dusk. Close enough this time that Amos got a clean look through the spyglass before the man wheeled his horse and vanished south. He didn't recognize the rider, but he recognized the manner of him, unhurried, methodical, a man taking careful count of a place before deciding whether it was worth the trouble of taking. Chenoa's face went tight and pale when he described it to her, and she said the name of one of her captors under her breath. Low and bitter, a name Amos didn't ask her to repeat. "They don't give up easy on what they consider theirs to sell," she said quietly, staring at the darkened pasture beyond the porch rail. "I have seen it before. A woman runs, and for a while it seems the running has worked, and then one morning the men are simply there again, as if the running bought nothing at all. This time the running bought you a rifle, and a man who isn't riding 2 days off, delivering cattle." Amos said, "This time it's different." She looked at him a long moment, weighing the words the way she weighed everything, and whatever she found in his face seemed to satisfy something in her, because she nodded once, sharp and certain, and turned back to watching the dark pasture with him instead of alone. The attack came 8 days later, in the gray hour just before dawn, when a valley sits at its most vulnerable and its defenders at their least alert. Amos had taken to posting himself in the loft with a clear line down the wash, sleeping in short, careful snatches, and it was a shift in the horse's breathing that finally woke him. Not a sound exactly, but the absence of the ordinary night sounds. A man learns to trust without ever quite noticing he trusts them. There were 5 riders moving up through the wash exactly the way Chenoa had guessed they might. Hard men with a particular economy of movement that marked them as no strangers to this kind of work. Amos held the rise behind the barn as planned, and Chenoa held the choke point where the wash narrowed. And when the first rider broke into the open ground between barn and house, Amos put a warning shot into the dirt at his horse's feet that spun the animal half around in a spooked, screaming rear. This land's spoken for. His voice carried flat and hard across the yard, rifle steady in his grip. Turn back now, and there's no cause for this to go any further. Gunfire answered him instead of words, and the next stretch of minutes passed the disjointed, slowed-down way violence always does for the people living through it. Chenoa held her position exactly as trained, calm under fire in a manner that spoke to reserves of steel Amos hadn't fully appreciated in her until he watched her draw on them, turning back two riders who tried to flank through the narrow gap and putting a bullet close enough to the second man's ear that he wheeled hard and never tried it again. Amos worked the rise, methodical, protecting the house and the barn both. And between the two of them, the yard that had become theirs to defend never once became the enemy's to take. One of the two flanking riders nearly made it past her, cutting hard through a gap in the mesquite Amos hadn't accounted for in their planning. And for 3 or 4 heartbeats, Chenoa was alone against a man, twice her weight bearing down at a gallop. She didn't freeze. She dropped flat behind the low rock she'd marked days earlier for exactly this possibility. Let him commit past the angle and put her shot into his horse's path, close enough to turn the animal hard sideways and pitch the rider from the saddle into the brush, where he stayed down, groaning, no further threat to anyone that morning. Amos saw it happen from the rise and felt his heart stop clean in his chest for the length of that gallop, and didn't breathe right again until he saw her rise from behind the rock. Rifle already reloaded, already scanning for the next threat instead of tending to her own fear. He understood watching her that whatever he'd been picturing when he pictured protecting her, the truth of it had turned out to be something closer to standing shoulder to shoulder with a woman who needed no one's protection quite so badly as she needed a fair chance to protect herself. It broke the way these things break when the cost climbs steeper than the prize ever justified, not in one clean moment, but in a gradual, ragged retreat, riders peeling off one by one until only 2 remained. And even those 2 didn't linger long once they understood they were alone in it now. The last hoof beats faded south down the wash as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, and the valley went quiet again, and Amos lowered his rifle with hands that had gone steady sometime in the last few minutes without his noticing it happen. He found Chenoa still at her post, rifle still level, watching the empty wash with the particular stillness of a woman making certain a thing is truly finished before she allows herself to believe it. When she finally lowered the barrel and turned toward him, tears stood bright in her eyes that had nothing to do with fear. "They're gone." Her voice broke slightly on the word, not from weakness, but from the sheer size of what it meant to her. "Truly gone this time." "Truly gone," Amos agreed, and crossed the yard to her, and for a long moment neither of them needed a single further word. Only the settling dust and the gold morning light spilling across land that no longer felt, to either one of them, like a trap waiting to spring shut. Amos spent the better part of that afternoon walking the wash and the yard, taking stock of what the fight had cost and what it hadn't. A section of fence near the barn wanted mending, where a stray shot had splintered a post clean through. One of the horses had thrown a shoe in the scramble to the sheltered pen, but stood otherwise sound. Beyond that, the ranch had come through whole, and so, more importantly, had the 2 people who had defended it, and Amos found himself standing in the middle of the yard for a long moment, simply breathing that fact in, letting it settle somewhere deep enough to stay. He had spent 3 years believing the worst had already happened to him, that there was nothing left worth the fear of losing. Watching Chenoa cross the yard toward him now, alive and unbroken, and entirely her own woman, he understood that belief for the lie it had always been. There was plenty left worth fearing to lose. There was, it turned out, plenty worth fighting to keep. In the days that followed, word moved through the territory the way word always travels, carried by riders who'd seen 5 men fleeing hard and empty-handed toward the south. And it seemed the message had landed clean. This valley, and the woman who now called it home, alongside the man who had found her, were no longer worth whatever it might cost to pursue them further. The fear that had lived coiled tight in Chenoa's shoulders since the very morning Amos found her on the trail began, at long last, to unwind for good. The weeks after the attack passed slower and gentler than any that had come before them, as though the valley itself had exhaled. Chenoa's strength kept building past anything the fever and the rope burns had left behind. She could outride Amos across the flat stretch north of the barn by then, and rarely let him forget it. And the sound of her laughing at his mock outrage over losing had become as ordinary to the ranch as the sound of the wind through the cottonwoods. She spoke more freely of her people now, of ceremonies and seasons and the particular kind of resilience passed down through generations of Chiricahua women who had buried grief and kept walking. And Amos listened the way he hadn't let himself listen to much of anything in 3 long years, hungry for the shape of a world outside his own narrow loss. In turn, he told her, finally, the whole of what had happened the night of the raid, not the edited version he offered strangers, but the real weight of it, the 2 days' ride he could never take back, the guilt that had calcified into the silence she'd first mistaken for coldness. She held his hand through the telling and didn't try to talk him out of any of it, only stayed, which turned out to be exactly the mercy he'd needed and never known how to ask for. One quiet morning near the tail end of that summer, with their gear already loaded and both horses saddled and waiting in the yard, Chenoa found Amos checking her mare's cinch strap one final time, and she stopped his hands with hers before he could finish the knot. "You saved me." She pressed a palm flat over her own heart, the gesture simple and unadorned, and more honest than any long speech could have managed. "Not only on the trail, in here. I believed for a long time that I was only whatever had been taken from me, whatever had been broken in me. You showed me something else entirely. You showed me I'm still someone who can choose, someone who can stand her ground, someone who gets to decide for herself whether to stay or whether to go. Which is it going to be?" There was a rawness in the question that surprised even him as it left his mouth. A smile broke slow and sure across her face, warm in a way that had taken every one of these hard weeks to fully earn. "For now, I am going to go find my sister, and I intend to bring along the man who taught me I could still choose things for myself, because I have chosen him too, and I find I would rather not make this ride without him." They rode out together that morning, north along the river trail toward the settlements where scattered families sometimes found their way back to one another. 2 survivors who had each been broken by hard circumstance and had somehow, against long odds, put each other back together piece by piece in the process. The ranch sat behind them in the climbing morning light, doors left unlatched exactly as they had always been, waiting patiently the way a home waits for the people who mean, one day, to return to it. If their story stayed with you this far, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name, and help this small channel keep bringing frontier love stories your way. When I find her, Chenoa glanced back once at the low, sturdy house growing smaller behind them. When all of this is finished, I want to come back here, to this land, to you, Amos. I'll be here. There was no doubt in it at all, only the quiet certainty of a man who had learned, the hard way, exactly what was worth holding on to once he'd finally found it again. The trail north wound first through low, scrubby hills, and then along the wide, slow bend of the river itself, cottonwoods crowding its banks in ragged green lines. And Amos found the country opening up around them, mile by unhurried mile, felt less like leaving something behind, and more like the two of them carrying the ranch's quiet forward into wherever they were headed. They did not yet know what waited for them along the river settlements, whether Dateste would be found alive and well, or whether that particular grief would join the others they already carried together now, instead of alone. They only knew they rode toward it side by side, which was more than either of them would have believed possible on the morning a half-dead woman whispered a single word into the dust of a lonesome trail, and a grieving man knelt down beside her instead of simply riding on past. Two people who had each lost nearly everything had found in one another a reason to build something entirely new, not a return to what either of them had lost, but a future neither had dared imagine until the other one made it real and solid under their feet. The land they left behind that morning would still be waiting when they finally came back to it, patient the way good land always is, holding its silence until the day two riders came up the trail together again, no longer strangers to each other, and no longer strangers to hope. Some stories end at an altar, and some end at a doorway left unlatched on purpose, a plain promise spoken under an open morning sky, and a long road stretching north toward whatever waits next, chosen freely this time, walked together and never again, not for one single mile of it, walked alone. Chenoa had come to that ranch broken in body and guarded in every part of her heart, and she left it healed, armed and certain, riding beside a man who had spent 3 years believing he had nothing left worth protecting until the day the trail dust settled and showed him otherwise. They kept the shawl folded careful in Chenoa's saddlebag that morning, blue wool against the dust of the trail ahead, a small piece of one grief carried forward into whatever came next, instead of buried and forgotten. Amos rode with one glance back at the low house on the rise, doors unlatched, the garden she'd planted still green and climbing along its careful mounds, and found he felt no fear at all in leaving it behind for a while. A home like that would keep. It was built to keep. And a woman like the one riding beside him now, steady in the saddle with the morning sun catching gold along the healed lines of her wrists, had already taught him that the things worth keeping were rarely the ones you could fence in. They were the ones you chose, morning after morning, to ride toward instead of away from. Whatever waited for them north along that river, whatever grief or joy Dateste's fate held in store, Amos and Chenoa had already given each other the one thing neither of them had believed, on separate mornings and for separate reasons, they would ever hold again, a future worth riding toward, together on their own chosen terms, one long mile at a time.